to you about some of the work I've been doing with Luke Bourne on understanding defensive contributions to different teams in soccer using spatial data. Now, I'm a huge soccer fan, so if you came to me and you said, which team had the best defense in the 2014-15 Premier League, I can answer that question. And what's more, I can tell you where their weaknesses and where their strengths lie. But if I wanted to back up some of my claims with some statistics, then I'd be presented with tables like this that give us how many goals each team conceded, maybe the average per game, and how they were distributed between the two halves. And maybe the number of clean sheets, or how many games a team went without conceding a goal. This is a good start, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about the team's state of defense. It doesn't tell us about their attributes or characteristics. And some companies like Prozone Sports have started going further. And they've started reporting defensive actions taken by a team when they do not have the ball. And we term these defensive actions as disruption events because they disrupt the natural flow of play of the opposition. So things like tackles, where a player attempts to dispossess their opponent. Blocks, where a player attempts to get in the way of a shot or a cross and intercepts, the most common type of disruption where a player attempts to directly intercept a pass intended for the opposition. So if we include this in our data, then we expand our table, and it looks something like this. And it raises the question, which part of this table contains the most information about a team's defense? So, for example, Burnley, Sunderland, and Tottenham each conceded 53 goals. Does that mean they had the same defense, that the state of their defense was the same? Well, no. Obviously not. The answer is clearly not. And that's obvious to us, the pundits that watch the games. But using the statistic, how can we differentiate between them? And in fact, it's always worth remembering the goals are extremely rare in soccer. There's only about 2.6 of them per game. Now, 2.6 of them per game is much lower than every other major sport you can think of. Things like basketball, rugby, hockey, American football, etc. They're much more higher scoring games. So goals in those sports contain a lot more information than goals in soccer. So we would argue that actually the disruption events, that's where the real information is. That's the thing that will tell us the state of a team's defense. So we're going to attempt to model these. But to model them, we actually need to know when they haven't occurred. So for that, we're going to use continued events as a proxy to indicate that the team still has possession. So things like touches and completed passes are going to be used as a proxy to tell us the team hasn't been disrupted and they're still in possession. Okay, so now we're in a position to write down a model for the probability of the disruption event occurring during the season. So here, y is our outcome. It takes a value 1 if the ith event was a disruption, so things like tackles, intercepts, block. And the value 0 if it was a control event, so things like touches, passes, and dribbles. The index I here indicates that we're running, it runs over every single event in every single game during the whole season. And to give you some idea of how big this data set is, for the 2014-15 Premier League, capital N is just under 1 million. So we have a lot of data, and we have a lot of information. XI attack simply tells us which team is currently in possession of the ball, and XI defense tells us who their opponent is. And we need to keep track of this because, as I said, we're fitting this for the whole season. So we want to understand the differences between the teams. Okay, so a probability of a disruption is then going to be equal to an intercept minus the attacking team's control coefficient. Now, this tells us how good a team is at keeping control of the ball, plus the defending team's disruption coefficient. And this tells us how good a team is at disrupting their opponent. And this is all wrapped up in the inverse logistic function, which just makes sure that the right-hand side is bounded between 0 and 1 because we have a probability. So this says that the probability of disruption is a function of how good the attacking team, the team in possession, is at keeping control of the ball, and how good their opposition is at disrupting their flow of play. So now that we have a model, let's look at a game and see if it is realistic, if it can describe what's going on. So this is a clip taken from Tottenham versus Chelsea, their 1st of January match 2015. And you see Chelsea begin the possession. They put together a couple of touches, a couple of passes, up until the Tottenham tackled them. And then Tottenham do exactly the same thing. So you see Chadley gets the ball, dribbles it down the wing, flicks it to Harry Kane, and takes a fantastic shot and ends up in the back of the net. Now, both teams essentially did the same thing. They put together a couple of touches, a couple of passes, but the outcome was very different. So what's going on? What's the difference? The difference is where these events took place. And that reminds us that soccer is fundamentally a spatial game. What really matters is where these events are taking place. So Johan Cruyff, one of the greatest managers and footballers of all time, when he was manager, he would talk about where people should run, where people should stand, where they should not be moving. He didn't talk about how many passes he wanted to see in the game, how many touches, how many dribbles. What really mattered is where these events took place. So this idea of incorporating space into analysis is something that people are talking about. And these are just a couple of examples I've seen online that I enjoyed, so I want to share them with you. And I know there's tons of others, and if anyone in the audience, and if I haven't mentioned your work, I'm sorry. So Kevin Munkers has been posting these really cool defensive heat maps for some time. The tactics room always has really interesting insights using spatial information. Tom Lawrence has done some fantastic work on defending your patch, and TT always uses spatial information in his analysis. So our aim is to define a new offensive and defensive team metric that encapsulates spatial information. And once we have this, we want to expand it so that we can learn a team-specific control surface, which tells us how good a team is at keeping control of the ball at different regions of the field. After this, we want to learn the team's disruption surface, which gives us the propensity of causing a disruption in different areas of the field. And we want to do all of this in a statistically rigorous and robust way that doesn't try to grid the field, but actually embraces the smooth and spatial aspect of the sport. So let's go back to our simple model, and let's expand it. Let's include SI. Now, SI is an XY coordinate reference over the pitch that tells us exactly where the ith event took place. So to model this, we're going to use a two-dimensional spatial process, which is going to allow us to obtain a smooth map of what's going on. And the posterior mean of this we're going to call the disruption surface, and this is what it looks like for the 2014-15 English Premier League. So blue here indicates high probability, red indicates low probability, and the data is flipped in such a way so the attacking team, the team in possession, is shooting from left to right, and the defending team, the team that doesn't have the ball, is going from right to left. So there's a couple of things that instantly stick out to us. We see this high probability of a disruption in the defending team's own half, and this makes sense. This is what we would expect. We also see these low probability areas in the attacking team's own half as well as the attacking wings, and again, this is what we would expect. So now that we've accounted for the spatial variation, let's look at our new metric. So this gives us the control coefficient, which tells us how good a team is at keeping control of the ball on the y-axis, and the disruption coefficient on the x-axis, which tells us how good a team is at disrupting their opponents. This data is for the past 3 full seasons of the English Premier League, and what these coefficients do is they shift up or down the disruption surface that you saw on the previous slide, depending on the side. So to give you an idea of how this relates to something we're all familiar with, this is a comparison with the number of shots each team took and had taken against them. And you can see there's this strong positive correlation between shots for and both our coefficients. And this makes sense, right? Because if we're better able to control the ball, we're more likely to take shots. And this correlation is reversed when we look at shots against. If we're able to disrupt our opponents, they're going to take less shots against us. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what this metric means, let's look at how the top team fares. And you can see, so this is so far away, my pointer isn't going to work, but you can see that the top teams had an above average control coefficient, and they tended to have a pretty high disruption coefficient. This makes sense. One really interesting observation that came out of this is the fact that teams that stuck with their manager for 2 or more seasons tended to have consistent coefficients across the different seasons. And if you look at, for example, Arsenal right there at the top, they haven't moved. And they're playing exactly how Wenger likes it. But now we can also quantify the way his team played. So let's look at one outlier. So one outlier is Stoke City. Stoke City were managed by Tony Pulis from 2006 to 2013, and they had this reputation of avoiding possession of the ball. In fact, they were the only team that was more likely to win a game when they had lower possession. Then Mark Hughes took over, and he revolutionized the way Stoke City play. And you can see this transformation just by looking at our coefficients. And this tells us, like, we're able to quantify exactly how this change has happened. Sticking with managerial impact, let's look at the team that had the highest disruption coefficient. So from 2012 to 2014, it was Southampton, and then Tottenham took the crown in 2014. So I'm sure some of you are recognizing this. These teams were all managed by Pochettino, and this is the Pochettino effect. He has a very high pressing style of football, and we're able to pick that up. Not only are we able to pick it up, but we're able to quantify, and we're able to say how much more he presses than other teams. So this tells us our coefficients contain information not only about the first team player contributions, but about the managerial impact. So now that we know what this means, let's expand our control coefficient. And let's give each team their own spatial surface. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, let's pick two teams at different ends of the spectrum. So Manchester City had the highest control coefficient in 2014. They also scored the most goals. And Burnley had the lowest control coefficient, and they scored the least number of goals. And this is what their surfaces look like. Blue here is good, it's above average. Red is bad, it's below average. And the data has been flipped in such a way so that the goalkeeper is always protecting his own goal. And from this, you can instantly see the areas of high probability, the areas of low probability, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities. And when we overlay this with the first team players that tended to play in these locations, you can start to understand some of their contributions. So for example, Nasri and Aguero tend to spend most of their time on the left wing, and they have a high control surface than Dzeko and Silva, who spend a little bit longer on the right wing. Now, in Burnley's case, you see that, for example, their forward, Danny Ings, was about half as likely to retain possession in threatening situation. And that's why they scored so few goals. Now let's have a look at another team. So Hull City had a relatively low control coefficient, and you can see this is their control surface. There's some asymmetries. The left wing is slightly worse than the right wing. There's a drop in the final third, and there's particularly the strange dip inside their penalty box. So let's look at Hull City in action. And this is taken from Hull City versus West Ham. And the play begins with a pass to El Mohammadi, who was playing a right back. But he likes to get forward. He's very good at, he can actually play as a right winger or right midfielder, and he crosses over, and Hernandez knocks it in the back of the net. So on the right, you see the build-up play. And notice how it traverses the areas of high probability. And this isn't a one-off. This happened time and time again. This is more examples of build-up play to Hull City's goals. And you see they only really go to the areas of high probability. That means Hull City are easy to defend against. They're very predictable. You know where their goals are going to come from. So what can we tell Hull City? How can they improve? Well, they really need to strengthen their left midfield. And they actually did that in the summer. They bought Sam Klukas. They also should let El Mohammadi play further forwards, because you can see the area where he spends most of his time. That's average. It's better than anywhere else on the field. So if he's allowed to go further forwards, he can get rid of that hole that we're seeing. And again, that's what the management did. They purchased Adebayo, who plays as right back, which allowed El Mohammadi to play further forward. Okay, so from the control surface, let's look at the disruption surface. And in particular, let's focus in on Sunderland's defense. Now, they had the second lowest disruption coefficient. Teams collectively took 700 shots against them. That's 200 above the average. They only conceded 53 goals, which isn't too bad because that's what Tottenham conceded. But Pantilimon, their goalkeeper, had to make 110 saves, and that actually ranks him as one of the best goalkeepers of that season based on that statistic. This is what their disruption surface looks like, and you can see, again, red is below average. You can see that it's below average in their own half, and in particular, there's these asymmetries present where the left back is doing better than the right back. So let's have a look at Sunderland in action. So this is a clip taken from Sunderland versus Aston Villa, and the play begins with Nzombie on the break. He passes it to Obonaho, and Sunderland are very good. They quickly get back, and they surround him. There's 4 players around him. And not a single one of them even tries to tackle him. So you're laughing and you're thinking, this is probably a one-off. That's not the case. Let's look at them against Southampton. And Wes Brown kind of attempts to tackle Perez, very half-hearted. Tadic is not marked. He just walks into the penalty box. Sunderland get 8 defenders, and not a single one of them picks up the run at Cork. So what can Sunderland do? They need to strengthen their defense. They need to fill this gap. And in the summer, they attempted to do that. They signed Carls from Liverpool for $2 million as a centre-back. They signed Matthews as a right-back. Then they carried on and signed 3 more centre-backs. And they even got the young American Yadlin on loan as a right-back. So from one team that let in 53 goals to another team that let in 53 goals. Now, Tottenham were managed by Tim Sherwood from 2013 to 2014, and then Pochettino took over at the end of that season. And you can see that under his tenure, both the control and disruption coefficients, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, increased. So let's have a look at the disruption surfaces. So under Sherwood, you can see it's above average in their own half. That's very good. It's kind of above average in their opposition as well. But under Pochettino, it's even higher, right? You can see these dark blue areas. So let's see these 2 teams in action. So this is taken from Liverpool versus Tottenham 1 year on. And you see Coutinho in exactly the same position, surrounded by 3 or 4 players. And under Sherwood, no one really puts him under any pressure. He's easily able to get the pass off to Sterling, passes it to Glenn Johnson, no pressure at all, and Caboose is in the back of his own net. But under Pochettino, it's so different. Instantly, he's pressed, not just by 1 player, but by 2 or 3 players. And that is what we've come to expect of Pochettino's style. And we can now quantify it by looking at these disruption surfaces. So this has taught us 2 things. The first one is that our disruption and control surfaces contain information about not only the first-team players, but also the managerial impact, because Pochettino did this without really buying many players. So this change was due to his style of play, and we can quantify this. And the second thing we learned from this is that even though Sunderland and Tottenham conceded the same number of goals, their defense are very different. And in fact, this season, the pundits have been praising Pochettino's turnaround of Tottenham's defense, and they've conceded the least number of goals. So in conclusion, we defined a new team metric that encapsulates spatial information. We learned the topography of where each team controls the ball and where they disrupt their opposition. We found out that our models not only are informative about the first-team player contributions, but they also contain a lot of information about managerial impact, and that's something you haven't seen before. And we also saw this connection between what we do, what we find, and what the management is doing. They're filling the gaps that we're finding, and this is just the beginning. So how can we apply this to soccer? Well, our disruption and control surfaces can be used to identify weak regions and bolster them. You can also use them to exploit your opponent's spatial vulnerabilities. It can be used to improve scouting. We can also expand our model and account for home and away differences, account for the current state of the game. Are you winning, losing, account for differences in information. There's a lot more we can do with this model. So finally, thank you. And a special thank you to Prozone Sports for providing all of the data as well as the video clips that you have seen. And a special thank you to the Born Lab for all of your help in this project. Thank you, guys.
So are there any questions?
So most of this is from open play, and honestly, I have not had the opportunity to really sit down and think about exactly what that area means. I'm sorry, I need to sit down and it could be due to many things that you have to sit down and you have to think about it and you have to look at which players are playing there to really be able to interpret this.
Did you look at anything at the player level for the players involved, either controlling the ball or tackling, or is it all purely at the team level?
So this is something we're working on, and I believe that one of the next steps is obtaining player-specific services like this. But so one thing, for example, our data providers, if we use player-specific information at that level, we would not have been able to share it with you. It would have had to be anonymized. So for this project, we stuck to team-specific things so that we could validate this model and show it to you guys.
Did you find any of the expected differences in disruption and control surfaces home and away that we would expect?
So we actually, we haven't got around to fitting that model. That, as I said, that's one of those things we're about to do. I imagine there is going to be a difference because teams play very differently in home and away, and that really is like the next step. So this conference has taken up a lot of time preparing, and I probably would have done it if I wasn't presenting, but you know, getting these slides is very time consuming.
Have you done any studies on team tempo, and how does tempo relate to the results that you had seen with this disruption?
So how are you defining tempo?
The speed of possession
Okay.
by a team.
So again, this requires the use of the player tracking data, which we do have. And we haven't got around to trying to do this just yet. As I said, there's so many opportunities, so many things we can still do with this. But again, if I had used that, it would have had to be completely anonymous. I wouldn't have been able to really present any of these videos. I imagine there's going to be definitely some connection there, but I haven't had a chance to explore it yet. We should talk about this after. It's a very interesting point.
I was wondering if you looked at the relationship between disruption in one area and disruption in another. Like Tony Pulis, for example, I think the way that he plays might be predicated on the idea that sort of foregoing disruption further up the field leads to greater success in disruption, you know, within your own penalty box or something like that.
Right, and that's what I meant by managerial impact, because each manager has a different way. So some managers want to be high pressing in some areas rather than others. And by looking at their disruption surfaces, we can actually pick that up and we can say that. But I haven't actually done any comparisons in between the different managers. I just know that this information is contained in what we already have. Very good.
So thanks, everybody. That's all the time we have now, but there is a poster session at 2:30 if you have any additional questions.
Thank you, guys.
We also have one more presentation coming up on tennis. I need to find my last presenter. Oh, sorry. Try to keep it up. There were a lot of questions. I felt like we could have gone for a while. But
Oh, I know. It's on the
Hi, I'm Mike. I'll be introducing you. Okay. How would you like to be introduced?
just Patrick.
Patrick? Okay.
So Patrick Wilson.
And see, you're just going to present from the computer. Yep. Do you have any audio or video or anything?
Yeah.
Let me see here.
Is it HDMI or video?
Sorry?
Do you have you should have
Yeah.
Yeah. You can go HDMI if you want. I just have that presentation. Do you have any audio on this?
mic. We have a clock here.
Okay.
Also, we can have timesheets if you would like, or if that's
That should be, yeah.
okay. So we're going to do 20 minutes for the presentation. If you're a little bit short, a little bit long, it's fine.
Okay.
And then a 5-minute Q&A afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I'll just pass the microphone around. We can hear, and I think we'll probably get started in a couple of minutes. So Patrick, Lucy? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Quite a Danny.
Yeah. I'll introduce you in the presentation and then introduce you again and call you up.